This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 334. Opportunity Cost and MMT.
We need now to work double hard to overturn
on the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. It's called the Phillips curve.
The government is too big, it's too intrusive, it restricts what we can do.
How does he look within, giving the grim data of the day?
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, for a while there was a lot of talk about modern monetary theory. During the pandemic, it was openly accepted, you might say, as the way that the governments could actually spend what was needed to cover the cost of dealing with COVID. But it's also now being blamed for inflation. They went too far, some people say, and perhaps also for a lot of misspending. That happened because it was easy to spend. So isn't that one of the problems with MMT? There is no discipline in a profession where everyone is taught to think of spending as happening at the opportunity cost of doing something else. We look at that this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen. Welcome along. So modern monetary theory tells us that governments can create money if they need to, that when they spend what's effectively new money that's pushed into the economy, that goes through to the private sector. People spend that money, that helps the economy grow because the private sector now has this money to spend and they can invest and build from. But Steve, I mean, that sounds like that should be the answer to our current problems, doesn't it? If we look in the UK, for example, we want to pay the nurses more or any public sector workers, you know, all those who are currently on strike, just increase government spending, go further into, you know, what many people would call government debt, you know, whether that's the right terminology or not, but you just create the money, give it to the people who need it, problem solved. But, you know, the core of economics, you know, as we're taught, is this idea of opportunity cost, that, you know, that any money you spend, you're spending at the expense of not doing something else. If you can just create money, governments can just create money, what happens to this idea of opportunity cost? Where are the controls?
Well, opportunity cost I would take out to the back of the boat shed and drown, because it's a crazy concept that makes no sense whatsoever in a macro economy. And the trouble is this sort of thinking is why economics has got itself in the bind it's been in for the last one and a half centuries. It's a very fundamental concept.
It's
a fundamental concept which applies to individuals and does not apply to the collective unless you're absolutely at full employment, going absolutely gangbusters. Now, if you look at like individuals, you've got 24 hours of the day. If you sleep for 8, you've only got 16 left. Whatever you do comes at a cost of what's left in the remainder. And that's why this idea of opportunity cost, I think, seduces the minds of economists, because when I ask my mainstream economist friends, and I have a few, what they think is the most important thing they teach their students, they'll all say opportunity cost. And I think it just shows how brainwashed you lot are, because when you're looking at the aggregate level, and that's what economics fundamentally has to be about, you only have the possibility of opportunity cost applying if you've got every resource fully employed. And therefore, to shift a resource from one location to another means the one it goes from has to have a fall in output. No. So you have to say, you know, you have to be considering the opportunity cost when what the economists call the production possibility frontier. So to get technical about this, the way that they, and I'm always going to say they, of course, the way that they will demonstrate this to their students. So they will draw, for their students, they will draw a diagram with one industry on the vertical axis, say manufacturing, another on the horizontal, say services. And they'll then draw a curve that links the two that's a bit like a circle. And the idea is that each additional amount you take from manufacturing will enable you to have more services, but you necessarily have to have a fall in manufacturing output as well.
Because of scarcity of resources.
Because resources are fully employed. Yeah. If you want to produce more services and less, then you have to produce less manufacturing. So your opportunity cost of more services is less manufacturing.
Right.
Now that is only...
Well, what's the constraint there? What's the scarcity? Is it energy or people?
No,
or
everything. Everything is supposed to be fully employed.
Right.
Now, the real world, that is nothing like what the real world has ever been or will ever be.
Right.
Because the idea is all firms are working at absolute maximum capacity. All workers have a job, et cetera, et cetera. So to have opportunity cost becoming a realistic constraint upon the economy at the macroeconomic level. You have to be fully employed, not just workers, but also your industrial capacity has to be fully employed.
So you're saying the theory is sound?
The theory is nonsense.
But if you were at that full capacity...
Well, you never know. I'm saying it's a bit like...
If you had full employment, for example, if everybody in the country had a job... then you've got the question, haven't you, about what what do they do? So that becomes then a question.
When you have, you will never get full employment of machinery. Okay, that's just because you can't produce anything. You've got to have both machinery and workers and energy and raw materials to produce any output. But if you do it in the stylized way that economists do, then you could imagine having full employment of labour, and therefore to get more workers in one industry sector, you have to take them from another industry sector. So you do have an opportunity cost at that level, even if you have spare resources, which you will have in every manufacturing firm, because for competitive reasons, firms have to produce below full capacity, because at their full capacity they can't expand into what they see as an expanding market. So you will. The whole point about modern monetary theory can be reinterpreted to say, well, all your theories about opportunity cost only apply if we're at the production possibility frontier, as you described, that curve linking different industries. We're not there. We're trying to get there.
Right. And yet, how close to it are we? Because if we look at, what happened in the United States, thanks to, and around the world, but the US is more profound than anywhere, thanks to the Great Resignation. We've got 10.5 million job openings in the United States. Go back 10 years, it was less than 4 million. We've got 5.7 million people unemployed. So basically, 2 available jobs per person in the United States. The unemployment rate is 3.5%. Go back to just after the 2008 financial crisis, it was around 10%.
Yeah.
So something's happening there, and that would suggest that they are pretty close to full employment.
Well, and that is a sign of a successful modern monetary theory revival of the economy. Because if you take a look at
all that COVID money,
it's an enormous amount. I mean, I've forgotten the scale of the deficit that America ran, but it was of the order of 20% of GDP.
Right.
Now, that's much larger than you'd want to have on a sustained basis in an MMT-informed world. It's a huge increase in the money supply in one single year. But the result of that was the shortest recession in economic history. And I recommend people take a look at the database that the St. Louis Federal Reserve maintains called the FRED database. And you'll see that on every chart they produce by default, you get grey bars indicating recessions. And, of course, the width of the bar is how long the recession lasted. The shortest recession in the history of America was the COVID recession because so much money was pumped in by the government.
Spent the way out of it.
Out of it, and instantly full employment.
So
it showed that it works.
Yeah.
Okay? And the thing is, what you'd like to have is people saying, "Oh, that worked."
A bit like Kevin Rudd with the cash injections into people's bank accounts during the 2008
the money
financial
that's in
crisis.
Australia didn't have a recession. Only 2 countries did in Australia and South Korea. So the government spending route that MMT says will get you towards that mythical production possibility frontier works.
Right, but gets back to that fundamental question though. So, how do you make decisions then? If there's, because rightly or wrongly, I mean, the economics profession is built on this idea of scarcity, which means that there has to be a considered decision about what you do with money. And if you lose that consideration because, is it A or B? Well, no, do both. What if if they're not the most effective way of spending that money? If you haven't got the controls.
Is scarcity the correct framework for analysing capitalism? And I think the answer again.
That's the question I was going to ask.
Huh?
Thanks. That's the question I was going to ask. Thanks for repitching it that way.
The answer is no. Capitalism has not been defined by scarcity. It's been defined by distributional scarcity, definitely. Okay, but by incredible.
What do you mean by that?
Huh?
Explain that a bit more.
Look, the rich get everything, and the poor get not close to nothing, but far less than the theory says they'll get. Okay, workers aren't being paid their marginal product, or that sort of nonsense. So you have enormous wealth for a small number. A reasonable standard of living and huge growth in that standard of living over the last 150 years, largely because of you exploiting fossil fuels. And it's the people who are getting a lousy deal out of this are the energy slaves. that we pay a pittance for, and they do most of the work, and we live in an energy-rich society without being aware of it. But fundamentally, it isn't scarcity; it's excess that defines capitalism. And what we should really be saying is this an excess one we can sustain? So I would actually turn that all around completely and say that if you had a modern monetary theory understanding of how the government creates money and how that provides money for the private sector, then the question is how do you do that wisely, given the constraints in which we actually live?
Well, that is the question. Which is the question I'm asking. Which, with the whole idea of opportunity cost is that really it's a question about how do you make a sensible decision, and how do you do that if you don't have that constraint of.
I don't think that constraint makes sense in the first place, because it isn't an absence of monetary resources that constrains what can be done in a capitalist economy where the government creates a large part of the money supply, or can create that part of the money supply. It's really, what are your physical objectives? Do you have the physical resources you need? Are you using too many resources? Rather than, like, opportunity cost implies you're using everything to capacity. We are probably 1.5, 2, 3 times the scale we should be using. We've gone well past the bounds. Not of what the factories can produce, but what the biosphere enables us to do in a sustainable fashion.
Right, and we're doing
in the
that.
Future.
And we have done that with this idea of scarcity hanging over our heads. So if you imagine how much worse that would be if we got rid of that.
No, I think it'd be a damn sight better, because the scarcity is about the scarcity of money, but at the same time, the attitude is being we can do what we like to the biosphere. This is the Nordhaus garbage, go for growth type stuff. The whole idea we can continue growing indefinitely on a finite planet. That is what's led us into the trap we're in now. And so the belief there's a scarcity of money has led to an attitude of physical excess. Which at the same time is shown as if we're living inside using our resources to their capacity, when in terms of factories we're not using anything like their full capacity, because they don't work the way the textbooks say they do. They always have spare capacity. But in the physical world, we're well and truly going beyond what we can take out of that physical world with our factories and still have a sustainable biosphere.
But who's responsible for the decision-making process then? So in a laissez-faire economy, which we're going to talk about next week, as to to the extent to which one exists, then it's whatever can make the most money. If we don't have that as the overriding factor, then how are decisions made?
Well, that is an extremely good question. And I think it's the way we should be thinking about 2023 and further on.
But it's sort of the question I started with, really. It's,
but getting away from opportunity cost, it's a question of how do we make sensible decisions for a civilization on a physically limited biosphere. That's what we should be doing.
Right. And it probably means it's because the money is created by the government. The decisions are made by government. But God help us, Steve, if we go towards almost like a centrally planned economy driven by the caliber of politicians that we seem to come up with.
We've got we're armed with the wrong people or the wrong ideas.
I'd rather have Elon Musk making all the decisions. I don't like him very much.
My God, that's a statement. From you, yeah.
So, what is the answer to it?
I think we're going to stumble through. And the question of how successfully do we stumble through is the real question. We may stumble through in such a way that societies collapse in the process and a new power structure comes out of it. That's probably the biggest fear that I've got for the next decade, that we are going to stumble and fall over. And all this focus upon the idea that we can actually work out, if we do this is the opportunity cost of not doing this, blah, blah, blah. It won't be those easy calculations. It'll be events driven by climate change.
So right now, should Rishi Sunak resign? No. That's, obviously. But no, should he say, okay, nurses strike, rail strike, emergency workers strike, let's just pay them?
He should. He should. Okay, because...
And then they come back and say, well, okay, let's try that again. That worked so well. And everyone else starts saying the same thing. Where do you... Well, no,
you've got to look at, how badly their wages have been suppressed in the last 30 or 40 years. Salaries in... I remember talking to a female friend about my pay rate versus the doctor, and then finding, to my surprise, that doctors got paid less than professors here. So the standard inside the NHS, the pay rates for doctors which she's talking about her brother, are incredibly low. No. So you've had people who have been exploited by the fact that they have a social conscience and they want to do good stuff for people. They're doctors and nurses because they want to care for other people. And as a result of that, they don't have the capacity to strike.
So there's an interesting line to pursue on all of this then. So I was reading about the situation in Sweden, and if you're listening in Sweden, I might have read this wrong, but it seems to me that everyone points to Scandinavian countries as a place where you pay high taxes but you get great services.
Yeah.
But in their health service, it's a bit like in Australia, you do pay some sort of gap fee to go and see the doctor. Now, you see, I actually think, there's a point. You pay up to a certain level. So if you've got a chronic condition, you're not paying, continually. But if you just go and see the doctor a few times a year, then you pay for that visit. Now, to me, that's a discipline that is worth pursuing because it means you are not over-abusing the system. So a bit of money paid for rather than just the free availability of money. So we've got to have checks and balances in
and what you're talking about is more checks and balances than opportunity cost.
Yeah.
But it's a question of what is the overall objective we should have on the planet. And to me, the idea that we make that overarching objective making money is why we're in the catastrophic future we face, because we've ignored the sustainability of that level of profitability on the biosphere. And we're now going to start seeing it. This decade is the beginning of seeing it in a serious scale, and we possibly have the breakdown of the physical system to which we rely to be able to have a booming economy. So we should be saying what is humanity's true role? And you come back to your Elon Musk comment earlier on, which we're doing a bit of an inversion here early on.
Well, he's clearly turning into a complete nut job now, isn't it?
The stuff over Twitter is a bit of a worry, definitely. But his attitude is our role should be to sustain and promote life. And that should be the role we see as ourselves as a species on this planet. We are the only species that knows, unless the dolphins have done the calculations themselves, that we've got about 300 million years before the sun wipes out the capacity for life on this planet. Okay, but I think of roughly, it's certainly of the 100 million year level. If we don't do something to get life off planet, life will be eliminated by the growth in the scale of the sun. So that's something we know that other animals don't know.
And except perhaps the dolphins. And
except for the dolphins.
And the reason you refer to that is because, of course, of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the dolphins do disappear off the planet.
So long and thanks for all the fish.
Exactly, because they know what's coming. So long and thanks for all the fish. Yeah, there we are.
So that's what we should be our first and foremost objective. And the question is, does capitalism give you the capacity to make those decisions properly? And the answer is no bloody way.
Right.
You have to have a constrained version of a private enterprise economy to enable you to make those decisions. And you need people who can understand those issues, and we don't have either. Right.
Well, we are going to take that bigger question next week, because that's exactly what we're going to look at next week on the podcast is, the future for capitalism. I want to focus a bit more on MMT and opportunity cost, which we've already says got no part to play in it. But when we come back after the break, have a think about this. You know, when governments spend money, I want to look at the inflation side of it, because that's obviously a consequence of MMT. Yeah. And, how much government money is spent on just maintaining operational costs versus investment. So when we pay the wages of private sector workers, I should say, that's an operational cost. It's not helping the economy grow necessarily. So I want to look at that when we come back. It's the Debunking Economics podcast with me and Steve Keen. Back in just a second.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So we talked, Steve, about how, yes, we should just give money to the nurses and doctors and all those public sector workers who've not been able to maintain their standard of living. That sort of makes sense. But if the government keeps on doing that with money that they create, that is an operational cost. And I thought the whole idea behind modern monetary theory was that if you do too much of that, that could be inflationary, and that you're pumping money into the economy And okay, sure, those people are spending that money, so it's helping. There's a multiplier impact of that money, particularly if it's going to lower income earners who are going to spend it quicker. But it's not an investment, is it? It's not an investment that's going to help the economy grow. And surely the idea behind modern monetary theory is not paying existing workers more. The ultimate objective is full employment, isn't it? It's creating more jobs.
Partly modern monetary theory is just saying, for God's sake, understand the system you're running. Because the frustration that I feel is that I know when I do the accounting in Minsky, I prove the essential points of modern monetary theory and the credit theory of money that I've also developed. And they're 100% correct about the nature of money creation. And therefore, if you're going to be guiding how to run a system, you should have a model of the system that's actually accurate about how the system works. So the first thing in modern monetary theory is to just understand what you're doing. Then the question is, how do you use that understanding? What does that lead to? Now, for a start, we spoke in a previous podcast about how neoliberalism promised there'd be such an increase in the rate of growth of private incomes that you wouldn't need the public sector anymore. Well, the reality has been that 40 years of that has left the bottom, certainly in the UK, 40 to 70% of the population running out of money on a day-by-day basis, unable to meet the costs they face in the private sector, unable to get the services they need from the public sector at the same time. And that's why there's such a degree of angst in the UK these days. So you want to reverse that mistake. You want to give those people the salaries they should have got that neoliberalism actually destroyed. So you do want to increase the pay rates of the lower level workers in the economy as well. And that then, because those people do spend what they earn, they simply have to, then you get an economic stimulus for that, which can mean the private sector in general finds more reason to invest. So it does have that positive.
So in fact, like the levelling up agenda that the government has talked about but never effectively delivered, actually pushing up minimum wages around the country so that spending increases around the country would be one obvious step towards that, wouldn't it?
Yeah. No, there'd be. I don't think people in the UK are conscious of the level of effective poverty that they live in these days, both in the infrastructure itself compared to what you find in Europe, the salaries compared to what you find in America. It's the poor here are really poor, and the UK still has a vision of itself as being, back in the days of Churchill and Queen Victoria. I'm sorry, that is
a very centralised economy here, aren't we?
All in London and all on services.
London versus the rest.
Yeah, and it hasn't worked. Okay, so if you're going to reverse that, then of course you need to start rebuilding your manufacturing sector. You need to be paying people decent wages so that the minimum wage is a reasonable living standard for the poor. And you've got to reduce the level of wealth that is taken by the parasites that my great mate Karl Marx once described as the roving cavaliers of credit.
So when I was scribbling some notes down ahead of this podcast, I thought, well, okay, the idea, the conventional thought on opportunity cost is, if I spend this much money on one thing, will it give me a better return than spending the same amount of money on something else? Yeah. And for MMT, it's maybe if I spend money on one thing, will it create more jobs than spending money in another way? Because the objective is maximum jobs. But in fact, it should really be, if I spend this much money on one thing, will it create better income for lower income earners, or will it bridge that gap? That's really the objective. It should be a redistribution exercise. So the opportunity cost, if we were to use that phrase, for a government should be, how can we spend this money in a way which is going to, in general, improve everybody's lives?
Yeah. And that becomes a positive orientation for government spending. And of course, it's
the government, of course, and MPs listening to this would say, well, that's what we are all about. But they might even believe it.
You normally believe your own bullshit. So I'm not most of the politicians do.
But that should be the objective, shouldn't it? It should be all about, because this idea of creating jobs is what MMT is. The ultimate aim is that everyone is gainfully employed, isn't it? That's the ultimate objective.
The ultimate objective is that workers don't pay for the ups and downs of capitalism. Okay, the booms and the busts should be borne by the people who invest, rather than the people who don't have the money to invest.
Right.
So when you see certainly capitalism booms and busts do hit the capitalists as well as workers. No two ways about that. But what?
So we wouldn't have central banks saying, "Okay, we need to tank the economy to try and get things in control." Sorry about that. That means a whole lot of people are going to lose their jobs.
Yeah, and the idea that
we're happy to see that
MMT would talk
happen.
about a job guarantee. So if you lost your job in the private sector, there'd be a public sector job for you to go to. And that means that you wouldn't have the same fear of losing your job or fear of mobility, which currently exists. It's the thought, and that is partly a counterproductive thing for a sophisticated society. You don't want to feel I can't afford to move. Because I don't know what's going to come on the other side. If you had more of a guarantee that you could change from one job into another, then you get more of a sense of freedom and more of a sense of innovation coming out of that.
So we've switched the idea of the conventional approach of opportunity cost, which is one of money. To a focus on jobs. That's in effect what we're doing with MMT, then, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean that's.
But is that?
But there's what I call the technical part of MMT, which is how is money created, and does the government borrow? And the answer is the government doesn't borrow. The government creates an income-earning asset for the banking sector as a recompense, fundamentally, for using the banking sector as a way to distribute government-created money to the private sector. That's what bonds are.
Yeah.
So the whole idea the government has to borrow is wrong. And once you realise that, then the constraints on government spending aren't constraints. The whole being in debt. The biggest scale, the hugest level of government debt the UK ever had was during the Napoleonic Wars, which it won, and which led to the growth of the British Empire. So when you look at the empirical data, the level of government debt is not a constraint at all. On the basis of this, it would be the most impoverished and weakest Britain. It was when Britain had its biggest empire. So there are errors of thinking. And MMT really getting rid of those errors. The other part of MMT, the policy part, is to say that once we understand how government money creation occurs, then there's no need for people to be unemployed as a control buffer on the booms and busts of capitalism. You could give them a job with a job guarantee where they continue earning income, they continue doing work, and they're therefore, when the economy in the private sector starts to boom again, they can move back into the private sector and not be de-skilled by a period of unemployment.
Right. Well, yeah. So it's the decision-making process in all of that, not the technical aspects of it, because we've spoken about that a great deal. Because I just see this as the weakness in the whole MMT, is how that decision-making process works, the substitute for this idea of opportunity cost. So in that example you gave, okay, you lose your job because there's an economic downturn. You have a guaranteed job, you say, so you're not de-skilled, so you can go back into the private sector when the economy starts to pick up again. But I mean, if that's just a job created for the purpose of creating a job, you almost certainly will be de-skilled. You'll be demotivated as well as de-skilled, because it's a job, in effect, a job creation scheme, which is there just to keep you employed. It's not necessarily satisfying or useful.
That
waste could be wasteful.
I mean, I'm more of a fan of universal basic income. I know that's it's sort of the
free money.
Get up the garlic clothes from a lot of MMT people, but my position is that it comes out of my ecological thinking as well as out of mainly out of the ecological thinking, just to bring it down to that. We don't want everybody working for a while. We want to reduce output levels drastically, but we don't want people starving because they don't have work to do. And I'm more of a fan of a UBI on that front. Right.
But isn't that what we're going through right now? Isn't that why we've got rampant inflation? Because there's not enough people out there producing stuff, but there's people who've got money to spend.
Well, no,
wouldn't a UBI, if it was a meaningful amount, wouldn't that create that problem that where there be lots of people being given money, got money to spend, but there's not enough people producing it to actually for them to go shopping with?
Well, no. If you look at what wage would be paid as a job guarantee wage, it would be less than you'd get in the private sector. So it's going to encourage you to want to, if the market expands again, to go back into the private sector. It's mainly the feeling you're not in jeopardy if you leave your private sector job or you lose your private sector job. I remember back, because I was raised in probably one of the few periods in human history where full employment really applied, which is Australia in the 1960s and 70s. And unemployment was 1 to 1.5%. Now, there was low rates of inflation as well, booming economy and a large public sector. It all worked extremely well until 1973 when it all fell apart. But I know that...
We didn't have independent central banks either. That would have helped.
But that period meant that you felt you could leave a job and go to something else. And therefore you had a feeling of independence and power that people certainly don't have today. And the fear, I think that's an incredibly uncreative element of the world which we've created.
So if we had a meaningful safety net, then you'd get that mobility.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how that relates back to that idea, though, about how governments are making their decisions. It's because that's my big question mark out of all of this, and that's why to what extent are we substituting opportunity cost by governments making decisions without any form of discipline? The only discipline they've got is that, as you say, if they understand what they're doing, then they'll know that there's going to be a point where if they pump too much money into the economy, then they're going to create inflation, which is sort of arguably. And
also they know that they don't have to borrow when they're creating that money, so they don't need to worry about the government debt. But then you've still got to how do you make sensible decisions? And that then comes down to having a systemic view of the world in which we live. And
would it be that different to where we are now in reality in the amount of spending? So government spending to GDP in the UK, according to the Office of Budget Responsibility, has only twice gone over 50% in the UK. One just after the war, and then one just after what we've been through with the pandemic. Before, it's always been around something a little bit above 40%, a little bit below 40%. It was a bit less during the Thatcher years, and a bit more towards the end of the last Labour government. Then it's fallen sharply during the austerity years. So there's a lesson in all of that. But it's that sort of range. We're not talking about deviating from that sort of range with MMT, presumably. We'd still see.
I mean, the thing about MMT, and this is actually a point that came through discussions I had in Australia back when I was running for office there unsuccessfully, and that is that why do you have high service providing societies like the Nordic countries also being high tax? And it comes down to the fact that if you are going to offer services to your public, then you are going to have a large amount of revenue needed for that. And the gap between your taxes, spending and taxation, spending exceeding taxation, that's where your money creation comes in. So if you're going to have much, much more services provided by the public sector, you're going to have a higher rate of taxation, also a higher, again, rate of spending. The two. So I think the UK is probably, if you look at the calibre of public infrastructure in the UK versus the calibre in Europe, you've got to increase it. So I can see a reason for tax rates to rise and government spending to rise, but spending to exceed taxation.
Right. But taxation doesn't need to increase, does it?
If you don't want to have too much money creation by the government, yes, it does.
Right.
The spending itself drags the tax level up. If you've got a target deficit, which is the amount of government money creation that's going to occur. So if you want to increase the number of government services while not creating too much government money for the reasons of putting too much inflationary pressure upon the economy, then you've got to increase your tax rate as well.
And still not understanding how the government makes its decisions, because there's a danger, isn't there? I mean, for example, they say, well, okay, we can create money. Building a high-speed rail link up to the North of England, that's not a problem. If the costs blow out, not too concerned about that. Pay more for nurses, pay more for all public sector salaries. We'll spend more on education so we get better educated kids. Do they just say yes to all of these things? What do they say no to?
Well, they would say no, I think, to the excessive income distribution that you have in this society.
Right.
The enormous salaries going to the finance sector. That's what if you look at where the waste...
So that becomes not spending, that becomes regulation more, doesn't it?
But it's failings on that front. I mean, there hasn't been investment worth speaking of in the UK for decades, both public and private. I mean, you have a public sector which has been trying hard not to invest in the belief they were making space for the private sector. The only part of the private sector that grew in that gap was the finance sector. And what you've got, consequently, you have an enormous trade deficit, importing a large part of your manufacturing and agricultural goods from the rest of the world. So it wasn't a case that focus upon scarcity and opportunity cost and so on led to better decisions. It led to decisions which weakened the capacity of the UK to produce not for its own needs in particular over time. And that's a sign of how failed this whole policy is. The UK is a much, much weaker economy and society than it was before 40 years of neoliberalism. So I don't think MMTs a worry in the direction of you won't make wise decisions because you haven't made them for the last 40 years anyway. But understanding how the system works so you can then create that money, that is at least... You start with an understanding how the system functions, then you can see the consequences.
But beyond that, how are you actually making, once you understand what you're working with and this ability to create money, how do you still determine what you do? That's what I'm having difficulty with. So you could say, well, okay, the objective is to make sure everyone's got a job. But then there's a danger in that, isn't there? Because you could say, well, okay, let's invest in a whole load of highly labour-intensive industries, which may not be that productive. So everyone's in a job, but it's a dead-end job, which could easily be replaced by machines. But we're not going to invest in the machines because we want to create the jobs.
No, I think you have to have, for a growing economy, a growing money supply. And the question of a growing economy, yet again, I've got to put that to the side. So
yeah, it's as to whether that is actually a good thing,
whether sustainable over the long term. But what you've had by this obsession about government debt is that the government hasn't created enough money, and what has happened to the private sector has grown more slowly as a result of that. The innovation of the private sector has declined as well as the public sector. And the private sector, if it doesn't have government money, the only recourse for it to get more money is private money. And so you've had a huge growth in speculation, not in investment. So I think if you got back to the stage where the government created the majority of the money circulating in the economy, and that therefore meant there was less need to borrow money, then you'd have less financial imposition on people,
sure,
and more capacity for money to be used for productive purposes rather than for speculation.
Now that makes sense. But, I still sense, though, just as we round off today's episode, that what I see as the weakness in MMT, and it's not in the theory of MMT, because that all makes sense. It is just the question about how you assign priorities and whether we're putting that. And I don't think you're entirely convinced on this, by the way. Either. I don't think you're entirely convinced on this either, by the way. That we are putting a lot of power in the hands of people who have demonstrated over the last 10 or 20 years that they haven't got a clue.
And this is the point. I mean, if I had to say, if I had criticisms of MMT, it's about the politics of it, and what
the practicality of it, actually. The practicality.
The practicality is quite relatively straightforward. The government creates money very simply by spending more than it takes back in taxes.
Yeah, and the problem in that sentence is those first two words: the government.
The government, the politics. And do you have a government which is beneficent, doing things for the benefit of society, or do you have a government which characterises the ruling committee of the ruling class?
Yeah.
And
do you have a government, for example, that awards PPE contracts
to their friends? Yeah, and that's what we've got. So you have incredible problems with the politics of the world in which we live. Now, MMT injecting it into that has to be aware of the cynicism and lack of sense of many politicians. And so it has to be a political reform movement as well as an economic reform movement. And that would say things like we have to find a way of representing people which doesn't get narcissists elected to make decisions for their own friends and their venal partners.
Yeah, I don't know how you do that.
There's actually interesting thoughts about it. If you go back to the Athenian democracy, you find that the way it was put together, the decision-making, was for using a process called sortition. And you would ask a group who then have to select people from another group who then became a part of a group that selected the next group, yada, 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 yada.
Sounds like preferential voting.
Huh?
Sounds like preferential voting.
The thing was, it was preferential selection.
Yeah.
And it was done in such a way.
So you get down to the last two and then it's a fight to the death.
Something like that.
That would be good. That would have stopped Boris.
But a sortition process, that means you've got a representative group, because what we call representative democracy is neither representative nor in a genuine sense of democracy. So a sortition process might select people who can represent the vast majority of the population, and then you need people who understand systemic processes. Genuine experts to make decisions about how you fight a pandemic rather than idiots like Boris Johnson. So that is what you need. It isn't just, you can't just reform the knowledge of how money is created. You've got to reform the power structure that controls the money as well.
Yeah. So that's a big structural reform for democracy.
And I think we'll be forced into it, not because we won't do it consciously, but what climate change is going to force upon the needs for governments to do to survive, they're going to have to learn those lessons through events.
So it's a bit sad, isn't it, that we went through the pandemic, because we did get a bit of that, didn't we? And that we had experts for a while. I mean, some people, they were lambasted for their expertise, but we had experts in charge during the pandemic. People were being guided through it by people who actually knew about pandemics, coping with pandemics. But now we've gone back to health ministers who fall into that portfolio, even though they've got absolutely no knowledge of how the health industry works.
Yeah,
the same in every other portfolio. So we need to. So we had a taste of it, but we reverted away from it.
We did
quickly.
it very badly. Okay, and that's I think we'll do the same thing very badly when climate change starts to become absolutely critical.
Right. So I'm going to sound like you. What hope is there for mankind, Steve? All right. Well, I'm still not convinced that we've got an answer as to how MMT could apply, but without significant change to the whole political process. That's the answer to it all.
We need the politics as well.
And then they're going to make the decisions, the real decisions which count, rather than the opportunity cost, which is the pure financially driven approach that we've taken at the moment, which has had its day and shown it hasn't worked. I think that's what we're saying today, isn't it? All right. And on that, next week, the broader question about are we reaching an end to capitalism? Are we reaching an end, particularly laissez-faire economics? Do we go back to what we grew up with, the whole idea of a mixed economy?
Yeah.
What was wrong with that? We'll look at that next week. Good to talk, Steve.
Good. Yep.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.